The Egyptians spoke of the land of the immortals. That's just one of the things we'll talk with Glenn Kimball about when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie with our special guest tonight, Glenn Kimball. Glenn, some of these accounts sound also, or the Book of Mormon seems to back that up. Would you say?
Well, I try to stay away from the very poignant religious documents. I try and stay with the kinds of things that I can find in text that I know where the actual hard copy is. But yeah, I suspect that there was a great deal of that kind of information that would coincide with this particular history. You know, I don't speak out for or against religions per se, and this is probably not the forum. I believe that the world has a basic core religious history, and each of them have a piece of that puzzle. And certainly, the good LDS people have a significant piece of the puzzle to say. Their prophet Joseph Smith was very interested in Egypt and had translated documents from Egypt that he had uncovered, and they have a story that's amazing to tell. But when it comes to the stories that are found in Michigan, they have all of the stories of creation, all of the biblical tales on these stone tablets, plus the stories of transport merchant activity in the Far East and other places as well. And you know, we look at these stories, and they are identical to the same accounts that are in Egypt. And what's amazing, if you go to Coast to Coast website tonight and you take a look at these images that that you so graciously provided the world.
Oh, but they're wonderful. Thank you.
We notice, for example, that one of those images is an image of the Sphinx. But when you're telling the story of the Sphinx to somebody, you're not telling them in a pictorial format. You're telling them with words. And so they didn't know how to draw the Sphinx. They drew a lion sitting on top of this stone framework, you know, and that's exactly how I would have drawn it if someone would have said this is the body of a lion on top of a stone framework. Very, very creatively done. Gives us some idea of the stories that were being told at that particular moment in time. And by the way, there were many migrations to the Americas. One of them happened right after the Roman occupation of Jerusalem after the death of Christ, when the Jews had to flee the Roman Empire. They fled along the northern coast of Africa into Carthage, picked up the Moorish sailors, and came to the Americas. One of the predominant tablets that I found most curious amongst the ones that are owned by Wayne May, and by the way, all of these images, with the exception of the coins, are owned by the Ancient American Magazine, are capable of being inspected, by the way. These aren't phantoms where they can't be scientifically inspected. But one of those tablets was of a Moorish sailor off the northern coast of Africa with a peculiar skull cap, which identifies him as coming from the epoch of the time right after Jesus, and it was found in Illinois. Now, what in the world is a Moorish sailor's picture doing in Illinois?
Good point. Good point.
And this is what Art and I talked about a number of years ago, was that we've been involved in an excavation spearheaded by the absolutely courageous man Wayne May and his Ancient American Magazine, which is on the shelves of Barnes and Nobles everywhere in the country. But this excavation has been very difficult. It's difficult.
Controversial too, wasn't it?
Well, it's very difficult because the ownership of the land, people aren't going to sell you the side of a piece of ground that has treasure underneath it, and we're not going to lie to them. We're not that kind of people.
I understand.
And in addition, the two patriarchs of the 6,000 acres of farm ground died and left the ground intestate. We've had to work out a deal. And we've finally worked out that deal. But then comes the problem of how in the world are you going to dig a hole in the ground 80 feet down and excavate a treasure and then secure it with security, with concrete security walls and gates and doors and how are you going to? That takes capital resources and certainly this is not we're not on this program to solicit capital resources, but raising that capital has been we have tried 100 different methods. We haven't been successful yet, but we got our eye on another one, and I can't even tell you about that one. That one's we're having meetings with that tomorrow with some of the people involved, and it involves a surprising cast of characters that were left in the wake of Harrison Ford, and I can only say that. That's as far as I can say. Harrison Ford, when he turned down Raiders of the Lost Ark, the movie, he left funding available. So we've been talking to those people.
That's exciting.
It's wonderful. This is so much fun, George. I can't tell you how much fun it is to tell. And what's more important than just being pure fun and being an adventure, this is terribly important for people to find the meaning of their own culture and to share it with people from another part of the world and realize that we weren't isolated here. What the protocols of the universities, we tend to tell the stories based on one single culture or one single perspective. That was the problem with the Gnostic texts, is that the people who became Christian after the death of Christ had their version of the life of Christ and belief structure, and the Gnostics had their perspective of the coming of this Messiah character, which clashed entirely, but they were talking about the same event, and they couldn't come to an agreement, and as a result, thousands of texts that contained the words of Jesus and Mary Magdalene and Peter and James and all kinds of the people that surrounded Jesus were basically abandoned by Western Christianity because of the cultural differences, not because of the substantive differences between people.
Glenn, how did we lose the knowledge of all this a long time ago? You would think that it would have continued to flow from generation to generation.
It did, George, and it's in our library system. But again, every generation has a new crop of children who grow up thinking that they're the best, the mostest, and know everything that's going on. And that's why Malachi the prophet in the last verse of the Old Testament said, before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, I will send Elijah the prophet, and he shall turn the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I smite the earth with a curse. We tend to have a generation gap every generation. And things get lost in that muck and mire. We think of ourselves, the United States, as being the greatest country in the world, and I admit we are. But if you've ever lived in the third world, as I have for extended periods of time, you realize that not everyone thinks that way. And there are people who really believe us to be villains. And to some extent, they have good reason to believe so.
The Immortals. Who were the Immortals?
The Immortals. You have to take the classes at Kimball College to understand it completely. But the Immortals were the people who did not die traditional deaths.
Give us the Cliff Notes version of the
Cliff Notes version is, you and I had a talk a long time ago, about Melchizedek being one of the Immortals.
Yes.
However, if you go to Hesiod, the class on Hesiod, he will talk to you about the fact that these people who called themselves the Watchers, that mentioned in the Bible, the Nephilim, Western Christianity calls them fallen angels, but they weren't fallen at all. They came from a fallen society, a society that had been destroyed. These people were great. These people were also called the men of old and men of renown. You wouldn't call a fallen angel men of old and men of renown if they were bad guys. Many of these men from the epic of King Kronos had learned the genetic capabilities of the human body and had merged them with their religious teachings, their faithful teachings, and Hesiod said that 10,000 of them survive death and walk amongst us in our day.
10,000.
10,000 of them. And so when the Egyptians talked about the Immortals, they weren't kidding. They were talking about real histories that existed, that come into our day. Now, whether that's true or not is up to someone's belief, but I happen to have met one of the guys, so I'm a believer. I mean, this is. I told you about that at one time, having met one of the individuals. These people are amazing. They They walk the earth. We don't know who they are until you catch them. Occasionally, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, you'll recognize one.
It sounds like the Highlander all over again.
Yeah, it really, really does. The history of the world is much more than we think it was.
And you believe this? Do you believe this is possible?
I am certain, because of my my medical training, that the body has the capability of living forever, and that we've only genetically, for some reason, natural selection made a humongous mistake, if in fact that's a real principle, in selecting the people who would die early instead of the people who had extended life periods. You think that natural selection would select people who lived longest as being the survival of the species, but that's why evolution is completely flawed in that particular respect, is that it adopted a body that artificially produces the chemicals of old age and death later in your life. This isn't natural. The human body is designed to replace itself and to be eternally young.
So you think when in the Bible, when they talked of like Methuselah living a zillion years and Noah living in long years, that those were real years, you think, maybe?
They're not accurate in one sense, that their calendar systems were different. They were based largely on 260 days rather than 365 days, so it's not accurate. But yes, they did live longer than we did.
Yeah, but I mean, if he was 700 years old, though, he was pretty darn old.
Yeah, he was old, and in fact, the age of the age considered during the Egyptian societies where a man became completed his years was 110 years old. Now, 110 years is an old man. Not many of us. I won't live that long. George, you probably will, because you're better looking than I am.
Who knows? I may check out any time.
When I check out, they're going to need a crane. You know that?
I just want to do it while I'm on the air. That's all.
You want to do it while you're on the air?
I want to go out in drama, high drama.
I want to be in a cave in Illinois, standing next to one of the 5 statues. Wayne Mays had some aerial pictures taken, some of the satellite photos where they can detect where mineral resources are in the earth.
Right.
And sitting right smack dab over the cave that we have identified, they have identified a hit for gold on that one single dot.
My.
And that's been recent, by the way.
That could be a huge vein.
And there's 5 statues in this corridor, one of which is made of heavy metal. That means it's either made out of uranium, plutonium, lead, or gold.
While I'm in St. Louis here, just a few miles away from Cahokia, we have, of course, the Cahokia Mounds, and they've been trying to do some tests, and they know there's another structure there. Is that the case in most of the mounds that we find? And do they ever carbon date them somehow?
Yes, they carbon dated the mines in Michigan, the copper mines. They definitely carbon dated them, and they carbon dated them to the year 1800 years BC.
So they're pretty accurate about that.
Yeah, they're very accurate. Carbon dating occasionally has flaws depending upon the competency of those who doing the testing. But the carbon dating is really well identified. This comes from the roughly 1800 years BC and coincides with the copper merchant societies of Gnosis at that particular era of time as well, and the Bronze Age in Egypt as well. And so all of these pictures that you see on Coast to Coast tonight, where it shows Egyptian reliefs, and the one I find most incredible is the very first one on your site after you get past the front cover. It's a picture of an Egyptian pharaoh, only she's a woman. You notice you can see she's a woman, and you say, well, hold it a minute. Egyptian pharaohs weren't women. Hold it. Yeah, there was a woman pharaoh, and her name was Hatshepsut. She's the one who built the temple right across from Karnak. If you've ever been to Karnak, you look across the Nile River, and you can see her temple prominently displayed there. She was the one where Horemheb and her son erased her face off all of the monuments. But she was also the one who chartered the Armada to go to the Americas to trade in copper. And to have her relief here in this stone tablet. How in the world could people have known that? How could they have known that? Not in the 1850s when these things were discovered. It's not possible.
No, but it's an incredible burst of knowledge that somehow is not found, and then, you and others like you do a great job in presenting it. You mentioned a lot, and you have in the past, about the Nag Hammadi, which was found near the Nile in, what was that, 45, 46, something like that?
1945. Mm-hmm.
What is the significance of that library being found?
Well, the Gnostic Gospels are an extremely large collection of books like the Bible. They have for example, the Gospel of Thomas has more of the words of Jesus than the Bible by many times over. And if you take the whole Nag Hammadi library intact, it has more words of Jesus by 100, maybe 1,000 times than that are in our Bible. And if you're Christian and you say you're a follower of Christ, what is so wrong with knowing what Jesus said? He certainly, if you look in our Bible, there are 70 some odd sayings of Jesus. Well, my wife says 70 things an hour. And she's Spanish, and I speak Spanish, but she does say 70 things an hour, and she's wonderful. But where was the rest of what he said? Certainly it was recorded, and in fact it was. There are oceans full of material. The Gnostics didn't just have the Nag Hammadi library. There were 760,000 scrolls in the Alexandrian library. We got our New Testament. The Septuagint, which was a Greek document, was in the Alexandria library. That was the Old Testament adopted by the Nicene Council, and we got it from Egypt. That's where we got it. We didn't get it out of Greece. We didn't get it out of the Vatican. I'm not trying to slight the Vatican for that. We got it out of Egypt. And how many more of the documents were in the Alexandria library? There's some have suspected that there were 50,000 Christian texts by the time of Arius and the Nicene Council, and when he made a proposition to Constantine to have them included in the Bible, he turned them down, and as a matter of fact, he turned them down with authority and said that if you wish to be a proponent of these, we'll declare you a heretic, which was tantamount to a death sentence, and they adopted all of his chosen bishops, the scriptures that were acknowledged by the northern Mediterranean bishops under his tutelage, and Arius capitulated. He had no option. Now Irenaeus and others of the second generation apostolic fathers denounced the Gnostic text, but only because the Gnostic texts once again were Greek texts. These came from a foreign culture. These came from a people they didn't understand, didn't know. They didn't know the traditions of Gnosis. The people from Gnosis were, here's a clue, the people at Gnosis were baptizing people for 3,000 years before Jesus. That's why they respected John the Baptist more than they did Jesus.
Right.
Remember we talked about this once on the air.
I remember that.
Why were the reliefs of John the Baptist in the caves found recently in near Jerusalem and not Jesus? Because the Gnostics and people who felt that Jesus went to John the Baptist to be baptized meant that Jesus was lesser than John the Baptist by somehow. And by the way, Jesus was missing anyway. He was traveling at the time. He wasn't wandering the deserts of Nazareth. Nazareth was a bedroom community for Caesarea. He was on the boats of his great-uncle Joseph of Arimathea sailing the world and meeting people and leaving his words, leaving his teachings and interacting with the people everywhere in the world, which is amazing. People don't know that, and it shouldn't be offensive.
Glenn, we've got to talk about the caves in southern Illinois when we come back. And also, I got cornered tonight from someone who wanted to know about the Da Vinci Code, whether I thought it was real. You and I have talked about this on the program before, but we'll talk again about it, maybe for the benefit of our friend here in St. Louis who just wants to know. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Soon I will be winging it back to the City of Angels in Los Angeles, where I trust the weather will be a little warmer than it's been the last couple weeks here in St. Louis. Free StreamLink weekend for those of you who would just like to dabble a little bit with StreamLink. You're going to have a great time. It starts this Friday night. The procedure, how to do it. you can call Lex Lonehood. I'll give you his phone number. No, I'm only kidding. Just go to the coasttocoastam.com website and read all about it. Take advantage of it. It's a free StreamLink weekend. I think you'll really enjoy it. Back in a moment with Glenn Kimball. The next hour, we'll take your phone calls with Glenn on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, Glenn, every time you're on with me, every time I get emails from people who want to know more about these caves in southern Illinois, you have created a hornet's nest with this thing.
Well, it certainly dovetails our discussion with the Michigan tablets. The caves in Illinois are not unique, and that's one of the things I wanted to demonstrate to people, is that these things have been found in all kinds of regions. If you go to the museum in Columbus, Ohio, and you look at a picture of the Native Americans who were supposedly the mound builders, or who were the mound builders, not supposedly, who were the mound builders, look how they are dressed. They are dressed in pants, button-down shirts, and a turban.
A turban, yep.
Now, what in the world is a Native American Indian doing with a button-down shirt, a turban, wearing pants? That's not the traditional dress that we think of as being a Native American. We denigrate the Native American Indians because we think of them as loincloth savages shooting buffalo with arrows. We didn't realize how sophisticated many of their societies were and how elegant the conquistadores found them when they got here.
Well, look, the Europeans had to take their idea of corn and how to plant corn back to Europe because of Native Americans.
Well, that's true. And you wanted to answer your question about the Da Vinci Code?
Yes.
I'm going to answer it in a way that's never been answered before.
Right.
We're coming up on St. Valentine's Day. By the time of Claudius II, Rome had outlawed marriage between the Roman soldiers and women, period. He had outlawed it entirely. This is before the Nicene Council. And St. Valentine, or Bishop Valentine, was performing marriages clandestinely for the Roman Empire, and he was jailed for that. And he met the jail keeper, the warden, for all intents and purposes, daughter who was blind. He healed her of her blindness, and he married her. And the last document he sent to her was from your Valentine. Now, that's just one of the stories of Valentine's Day. It's the greatest love story in history. It's one of the classes for this month on the website. But the fact remains is that later on the Vatican adopted the policy of celibacy somewhere around the 7th or 8th century, and celibacy became something. Being married became something dirty or something unholy or something to be tolerated, rather than being something that was well accepted and always had been accepted. Was certainly accepted at the time of Christ. You couldn't be a rabbi without being married. For us to think that Jesus was not married is following the Italian tradition that was begun by the Roman emperors to protect the Roman soldiers from having family problems and inheritance problems, and later by the Catholic priests from having family problems and inheritance problems. Celibacy was not a practice of purity; it was a practice of convenience on both parts. And,
all right, go ahead.
And certainly, the fact that Jesus' supposed wife Mary Magdalene, there are documents in the Nag Hammadi library, found on the banks of the Nile River, which indicate that he was coupled with Mary Magdalene. She went back and lived in Marseille, France, which was, by the way, settled by the people from Gathalis, who were Greek. We have to thank these Greeks for everything. You're Greek. You ought to know that. We ought to thank your people for everything.
Well, I'm close to Greek, but
well, anyway, she settled in Marseille because the people who had fled at the time of the Babylonian conquest from Jerusalem were the daughter of Zedekiah, Tetefi. She went there, and she was the great ancestor of Jesus. And Jesus' grandmother was born in Brittany, and Mary Magdalene moved back to be closer to where she could be protected by the people who loved and cared about her and next to her family. and that would be the logical.
So you accept that thought that there was a marriage and there were children.
Yes, I do. There's at least 1,000 people in Australia alone who can trace their genealogy, father to son, back to the family of Jesus. It's not unusual. I mean, it's been 2,000 years, for goodness sake.
In Australia?
Well, in Australia alone, 1,000 people who have done their genealogy and trace it back to Jesus.
Do any of them, Glenn, have any kind of supernatural, spiritual powers? Any of them?
Well, I'm going to say something, and I want you to think I'm special, but I've done my genealogy, and I've traced it right back to him as well. But no, I have nothing supernatural. I'm just an old fat guy that loves history more than life itself.
Yeah, but all right, but you've been let in on a few of these secrets, so maybe there's something going on here.
Well, I just have followed the masters like yourself who've had the courage to be able to tell it like it is and give people like myself the opportunity to tell you what we thought privately, tell the rest of the world. You're really the heroes of the world. We wouldn't have said what we said if it hadn't have been for you giving us the forum.
Many years ago, these ancients started their trek, whether it was over the ocean or, if perhaps the continents were much closer then, they were able to get through that way. I'm just amazed, though, that history merely picks up at 1492 with Columbus. And all these others, they just seem to forget. This should be a major story. This should be a headline in the New York Times or in Newsweek magazine or on the cable networks, that ancients from Egypt and Greece and other regions of this planet came here thousands of years ago, and it's not.
Well, here's one. Go to your website. The very last picture on your website is a picture that is a fresco painted on the Stoke-Dry Cathedral in the 7th century A.D., 800 years before Christopher Columbus. It's a picture of King Arthur being killed by who?
Well, he looks like he might be killed from those in the Americas.
By Native American Indians. That's who he was killed by. And he was brought back to, Gunnar Thompson claims that his tomb's still in Nova Scotia. He may have been buried there for a while. If you listen to Wilson and Bram, who wrote the book Holy Kingdom, his body was brought back to England and was buried there. And they've got a tomb there of him too. But under any circumstances, it was the belief in England at the time of King Arthur that he was murdered in the Americas. Now, how did they know about the Americas? King Arthur stood on the west coast of England, and he said, "My Avalon is there. It's beneath the constellation of the Americas," which was a star constellation. A lot of people think that the Americas was named after Amerigo Vespucci. Well, Amerigo is masculine. Americas is feminine. Americas for the estrellas, the stars, which is feminine. It had nothing to do with Amerigo Vespucci, and scholars have now realized that it was, in fact, a constellation in the far west, and that's where he said he got all of his treasure from. That's what made him a great king.
Why was he killed?
What's that?
Why was he killed?
He was probably killed because he was out there looting precious metal and not behaving himself, coming across with military weapons and.
Okay.
I mean, you see an army coming over the hill, you don't think that they're going to deliver the Avon lady, you know?
That's true. You're going to fight back.
Yeah.
What about your work or research? Does it say anything about the Chinese coming over here?
That's one of the wonderful things about Gunnar Thompson's book. Absolutely. One of his 9 voyages was the fact that the great Emperor Fusang, in the, what was the name? It was the Lang of Fusang. It was the Emperor He knew about the Americas. He had a map of the Americas, and that's part of the ancient maps that are still contained in China. He had organized an armada. He had heard about the food of the gods. Now, this food of the gods is very strange because the food of the gods that he was looking for was a mushroom. Okay?
A mushroom?
A mushroom.
Oh, I can't remember the name of the mushroom. I had several guests on.
Well, you're talking about the mushroom
was
in the Middle East. I'm talking about the mushroom that was found in the Amazon.
Okay, was it a hallucinogenic mushroom?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. I just can't remember the name of it. But
and he sent his armada over there to find the source of the green stone, which was jade.
Jade, right?
Seekwood, dyewood, excuse me, and also to find this food of the gods, which was supposedly cause him to live forever. And when they came back, they brought back a repository of the mushroom, which they were surprised to find it for sale in the Americas for pennies. It was nothing. It was common. They sold it for dirt there. They were able to obtain a quantity of jade. They were able to get all the treasures that he wanted. They lied to Emperor He and told him that they did not bring back the food of the gods, but that they had made an agreement with the Americans that if they would send 3,000 of their most beautiful people and most highest-ranked scholars back to the Americas, that they would allow him to eat the food of the gods. And he agreed. So he gathered up over the next couple of years the most famous, beautiful people from China and sent them over to the Americas, and they left with him these hallucinogenic mushrooms, which obviously didn't extend his life, maybe made his life funner, I don't know, but he didn't survive for a longer period of time. These people went back, and by the way, that was the very period of time when the Toltecs came into being and the Mayans came into being and supplanted the civilizations of the Olmecan Empire. And by the way, the writings from that period of time include Chinese characters. And so
the mushroom, by the way, is the muscaria mushroom, I believe, if I remember. That's the one, the hallucinogenic mushroom. If I didn't say it now, Glenn, I'd go crazy. You know how you get these things on the tip of your tongue? You got to spit it out right in the middle of everything?
Well,
so I'm sorry I interrupted you, but go ahead.
Well, may I just respectfully disagree for one reason? After having lived in South America for a long time, there's probably 4,000 different hallucinogenic mushrooms.
Oh, so
it's not one type.
Okay.
I know I've spent time there in the Amazon with the medicine men, and I asked them. One time I asked the guy. I said I had a toothache; it was killing me, and I didn't trust Bolivian dentists. Pardon me, I didn't mean to offend the country of Bolivia, but I just didn't trust the Bolivian dentist. And he said, I went to the medicine man and said, "Hey, man, is there anything you could do to kill my toothache?" He said he pulled out his wooden box and he gave me a little white flower and he called it arrayan. He says, "Chew this on your tooth and it'll make it feel better." So I'm chewing this arrayan. I can remember the name today because it had such an impact on me. The whole left side of my body went numb.
A little bit too much, huh?
I don't know what it was. It's been mentioned in drug manuals in some isolated instances, but they have tens of thousands of medicinal herbs that they felt they were taught to discover by the great pale prophet that had come to visit them, who taught them agriculture, construction, as well as their religions. So it's amazing what they have over there that we haven't begun to discover the tip of the iceberg in terms of the archaeology, the medicines, even the agricultural styles that the irrigation methods that they use. It's amazing what they did in the Altiplano to be able to grow crops at 13,000 feet, and what they did in the Amazon jungle to have prolific farms there with good topsoil. The Amazon jungles are filled with this yellow clay that's almost non-productive. I mean, it's just horrible. But there's these pockets that they were able to artificially man-construct that allowed them to grow crops right in the middle of the Amazon jungle. And they claim now, as you fly over it, you can see these crop areas that they probably fed 50 million people at the time of the coming of the conquistadors, who died probably of measles when the conquistadors came through.
Do you believe that this planet had giants roaming it?
I'm sure they did. I took pictures of myself alongside the two mummified giants in Lima, Peru. They were 9.5 feet tall. Their golden crowns made of solid gold, where I could have put two of my heads in them. Their fingers were 11 inches long. Their cloaks or their capes that they used were 14 feet tall. These guys could have played for the NBA and dunked at eye level. I took pictures of me alongside them, so the answer is absolutely.
Genetically altered, perhaps, a long time ago?
They didn't look genetically altered to me in any way.
You're not a believer in extraterrestrial visitation, are you?
I am.
Oh, you are?
I most certainly am.
Yeah, me too.
But I come from a different perspective, obviously. The Betty and Barney Hill spoke. You remember their visit?
Sure. By the Greys. The Greys, I think, abducted them.
Well, he was a Baptist minister. Remember?
Yes.
And he asked the aliens, "What about this Jesus?" And they told him very frankly. They said he was the God of 12 worlds, and yours is the wickedest of them all, and the only place that would kill the Messiah. And by the way, that's the reason why the 12 zodiac symbols are mosaiced in marble on the floor of the Vatican to this day, representing the 12 constellations in which these worlds were located. The answer is yes, I do. I think like Stanton Friedman that we have to look that not all of the tales that we tell are authentic, but not all of the tales are false either. It's not possible. But to think that these people weren't related to us or connected to us in some way, that they were purely alien, I don't think is the case. I think that they were somehow connected with us in the as being children of the same deity.
And you think we had high technology?
I think we had enormous technologies here. When the conquistadores came here, they found cities that were lit with these street lamps that were not lit by fire or by electricity. They mention them. Pizarro mentions them in his diary. There were all kinds of things here in the Americas that were advancements, technologically speaking, over things that we can even understand to this day, not the least of which was the moving of giant stones. I mean, the largest stones in the world that were ever moved are on the tops of the Andes Mountains. They're strewn about. There's perfectly square stones.
How'd they get up there, Glenn?
They're 9 million pounds. 9 million pounds. We're not talking about the rose quartz sarcophagus stone in the Egyptian pyramid, which is dwarfed by these stones. They're strewn about like tinker toys. How in the world did they get those things up there?
Unless we did a total flip of the planet, I don't know.
Well, they certainly didn't drag them up with Egyptian slaves.
No.
And they didn't do it with wood because it was well above the tree line.
Your buddy Zahi wouldn't like to hear you say that. You know that.
I know. Well, Zahi and I would agree on so many things. I also don't agree that the pyramids were built by slave labor. He claims that the pyramids were built by conscript labor, and he's absolutely right. And I also believe that the people under Moses were more like indentured servants than slaves. The history of Egypt was not the same slavery style as was done in Rome.
By the way, real quick, I've been getting some emails when you said King Arthur II, right?
Right.
You're saying was killed, not King Arthur II, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll be back in a moment. Time to open up the phone lines with our guest, Glenn Kimball. And then in the final hour of the program, I'll just have open lines, just you and me, talking about things that are just going on all over this universe. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM.